In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to create a frequency chart, and then using that frequency chart, how you can draw a histogram, a frequency polygon, and then after that, we'll go over a time series graph. Okay, in this first example, we have some data listed here, and this data represents the number of books bought by 50 part-time college students at a local college. And this is going to be what's called discrete data, and that is because it's something that is countable. Okay, so in the first part, we're going to create a frequency chart. And so I have the categories set up here on what we're going to enter in our frequency chart. We have class limits, class boundaries, then the midpoint frequency, relative frequency, and cumulative frequency. Now, according to the directions, we want to create 4 classes, and that means we're going to create 4 groups, and then each group is going to represent one of the bars when we draw our histogram. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how wide our classes or our intervals, or when we look at our bar on the histogram, how wide is that going to be? And so we're going to use our classes to figure that out. So to find our class width, we look at, of all the data, what's the maximum value, we subtract the minimum value, and then we divide that by the number of groups that we want to break it up in. So in this case, we want to make 4 classes. So we're going to divide by the number of classes. So for this specific example, when we look through all this data, we're going to find that the maximum value is 8, and the minimum value is 1. And because we want 4 groups or 4 classes, we're going to divide by 4. And that will tell us how wide our bars are going to be, or how wide our groups are going to be. When I take 8 minus 1, that's 7, and I divide by 4, we're going to get 1.75. Now, when you create your class widths, you always want to round up to the next whole number. Even if this itself comes out to a whole number, if it came out to 2, you want to round up to the next whole number. So in this case, if I take 1.75 and round up to the next whole number, we're going to round up to 2. So our class width in this case is going to be 2, which means in each of our groups, we want 2 numbers. Now, when we create our class limits, that's going to give us an idea of how we're going to group them. So that's going to be our starting point. We always start with the minimum number first. Our minimum number is 1. And since we want 2 numbers in our class, the numbers, we're starting with 1, and when I want 2 numbers, so we're going to include 1 and 2. So the class limits are going to go from 1 to 2. Another way you can look at it, when you set up your class limits, because you're including the first number, you take the minimum value and then add 1 less than the class width. So that's another way to look at it. So I take 1, that's my minimum, and I add 1 less than the class width. The class width is 2, so I'm going to add 1 less than that, which is 1. So 1, and I add 1, I get 2. So my class limit should be from 1 to 2. Then when you drop down to the next class, or the next group, I'm going to start at the next whole number. So that's going to be 3. I want 2 numbers in that group, so I'm going to do 3 to 4. And then the next one is going to start at 5, and I want to go from 5 to 6. And then the next one's going to be at 7, and I want to go from 7 to 8. So each time I take the lower limit and I added 1 to get the upper limit. And remember, 1 is 1 less than my class width. My class width is 2, so 1 less than that would be 1. So I'm going to add 1. So I get this by taking 2 minus 1 gives me 1. Okay, now the class boundaries is going to be how we set up our bars in our histogram. So when we create a histogram, we don't want any gaps between the bars. Historically, that's what statisticians liked when they set up a histogram. They'd want no gaps between the bars. So we want the bars to butt up against each other. So if you notice, if I go from 1 to 2, and then I drop down to the next class, I'm starting at 3. So there's a gap between 2 and 3. So any numbers that fall between 2 and 3 are going to create a space, like 2.3, 2.4, 2.5. Okay, we don't want any gaps between there. So the class boundaries helps us fill in that gap. So I'm going to go out a half in either direction of my class limits to fill that gap. So if I go out from the left of 1, I'm going to make that 0.5. I go a little bit to the left of my minimum number and a little bit to the right of my upper limit. So I'm going to go from 0.5 to 2.5. Now, when I start at the next one, 3, if I go a half out to the left, that's going to be 2.5. And then a half out to the right of 4 would be 4.5. Notice now we're filling the gap. So if I look at the class boundaries, if I look at the first class, I go from 0.5 to 2.5, and then I start again at 2.5 on the next row, so there's no gaps. Now you're probably asking, why don't we just do that with the class limits? Why don't we go from 1 to 2 and then 2 to 3 on the next line for the class limits? Well, if we do that, what's going to happen is, let me make a little side note here. If we do that, then when I go to figure out what category to put 2 in, do I put 2 in the first category because that ends in 2, or do I put 2 in the second category because that starts with 2? So you don't want any of the numbers that you have in your data value to be any of your endpoints, because then it's unclear which group to put them in. So that's why we create the class limits to get us started, and then we fill the gaps and go out further, one more decimal place than we have in all of our data values. That way we know that the data values are not going to be any of the endpoints on the class boundaries. All right, so we're going to continue this pattern. And then this is going to be 6.5. to 8.5. So when we eventually get to our drawing our histogram, this is what we're going to use to create our bars. Okay, now for the midpoint. When we find the midpoint of our class boundaries, we're looking for the center of that interval. Now, we don't need this really for the histogram, but when we go to make our frequency polygon, we're going to need these values. So to find the midpoint, we're going to take the lower class boundary. I'm going to label that LB for lower boundary, and I'm going to add the upper boundary, and then I'm going to divide by 2. So if I take 0.5, that's my lower boundary, and I add that to 2.5, and then I divide by 2, I'm going to get 1.5. So 1.5 is the halfway point between 0.5 and 2.5. Now to get the next midpoint for the next class, I'm going to take 2.5 and add it to 4.5, and then take that answer and divide by 2. When I do that, I'm going to get 3.5. So you just continue that pattern, and you just keep adding the lower boundary to the upper boundary, and then you divide by 2. So you're going to get these values for your midpoints. For the third class, you'll get 5.5. And then for the last class, you're going to get 7.5. And again, we're not going to use those for the histograms, but we're going to use that for the frequency polygon. Now, for the frequency, what you're going to do is now you're going to look at your class boundaries. So 0.5 to 2.5. You're going to find all of the values in the data set that fall between 0.5 and 2.5, and you're going to count how many there are. So when you go through and count how many values lie between 0.5 and 2.5, you're going to get 19. When you count how many values are between 2.5 and 4.5, you're going to get 21. When you count the number of values that fall between 4.5 and 6.5, you're going to get 8. And then for the last class, when you count the values between 6.5 and 8.5, you're going to get that there's 2 values for that. Now, it's a little bit messy when you have a lot of data and you're trying to count how many fall between these values. It's easy to miss one. So I'm going to hop over to my calculator and pull that up on the screen. And I'm going to show you how you can use your graphing calculator to sort the data and make it easier so you don't miss any values. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to enter the data on the calculator. And to do that, we're going to hit the Stat button. And then under the Edit option, we're going to click Edit. And if you have anything in L1, you want to enter your data in this list here. So if you have anything in L1, you want to go up, use your arrow, make sure you're highlighted on L1, and then hit the Clear button and then the Enter button. And that will clear out your whole list all at once. Now I have my data pre-populated in my list, but go ahead and pause the video and you're going to enter all your data values from this chart in your list 1. So you're just going to hit, so when you're looking at the first row of your data, you're going to hit the 3 button, and then you're going to hit enter. Then you're going to hit the 5 button, and then you're going to hit enter. And you're just going to go through and enter all those values. The order doesn't matter. Just take your time because if you enter in something incorrectly, of course, it's going to throw your answer off. So I always highly recommend that once you enter your data, you double check it. So go ahead and hit pause on the video, take a minute to enter, and then unpause. Okay, once you have your data entered, then what you're going to do is we're going to sort the data, and this will make it so much easier when we're counting so we don't miss any values. So you're going to hit the Stat button, and the very first option says Edit. That's where we put our data in the list. Then the second option says Sort A, and the third option says Sort D. Sort A means sort ascending, which means it's going to go from lowest to highest. And sort D means sort descending, which means it's going to go from highest to lowest. So pick what your preference is. I always like to go sort ascending. So I'm going to pick option 2, and I'm going to hit enter. It's going to bring me back to the main screen, and it's waiting for me to tell the calculator, it's waiting for me to input what list I want to sort. I put all my data in list 1, so I want to tell it to sort list 1. You'll see right above your 1 button in a different color, mine's in blue right here, it says L1. Those are your list buttons above your number buttons. So your list 2 is above your 2 button. So it's color coordinated. Since my L1 is in blue, I want to hit my second button first. It's color coordinated with your shifts. So I'm going to hit second, and then the 1 button, and my L1 should come up. Then I'm going to close my parentheses, and I'm going to hit enter. Then it will say done. So when I go back into my list, it's going to be sorted. All the data values are going to be there. It's just going to be sorted in order now. So I'm going to go back to Stat and Edit, and you'll see that all my values are now in order from smallest to largest. And I can scroll through and find everything now. So this makes it much easier when you're trying to count because it's in order and you won't miss anything. So if I want to count all the values that are from 0.5 to 2.5, anything that falls in that category, I can just arrow down and count until I get out of that interval. Then I start counting for the next interval. Okay, so now that we know how to use our calculator to find the frequency easily, Then we're going to go through and look at the relative frequency. The relative frequency is basically wanting a fraction, a decimal, or a percent. It doesn't matter how you write it. The only thing I suggest is when you're doing this online with the homework, just pay attention to how the question is worded, how they want the relative frequency entered in. But basically, you just want to find out what's the portion of values that lie on that class. Okay, so since there are 50 values in this data set that we just looked at, and 19 of them fall between 0.5 and 2.5, we're going to say that the relative frequency is 19 out of 50. And then, of course, we can put that in decimal form if we want, and I'm going to put it as 0.38. Or you can say 38%. 38% of the data lies between 0.5 and 2.5 on that first class. Now, the second class, we have a frequency of 21. So I'm going to have 21 out of 50, and you can put that in terms of a decimal and put that that's 0.42. Or you can say 42%. Approximately 42% of the data lies on the interval from 2.5 to 4.5. And we're just going to go through and do that for the rest of the classes. For class 3, that's about 16% or 0.16. And then for the last class, it's 2 out of 50, so that's about 4%. Now, the last column is cumulative frequency. And remember, cumulative is a fancy way of saying we're going to add. We're going to add up all the values. So when I look at the first class, I'm looking at the frequency because it's saying cumulative frequency. I'm starting off with 19. When I bump down to the second line, I want to know up to that point, what's the frequency together? I'm going to add them up. What's the cumulative frequency for everything up to the second class? So I'm going to take 19 and 21 and add that, and I get 40. So the cumulative frequency for class 2, everything up to class 2 is 40. Then I'm going to do the same thing, and then I'm going to add it to 8. So for the cumulative frequency for the next class is going to be 48. Everything up to that point is added up. Then when I get to the last class, I'm going to add in the 2, which gives me a 50. Now this value here should always be the total of all data values. If this comes out to be incorrect and it's not the total data values that you have in your data set, then you missed a value somewhere. So it's also another way that you can check your answers. Now, we're not going to cover it in this lesson. However, we can create a graph for the cumulative frequencies, and those graphs are called ogives. If you're interested, you can look it up online, and ogive is basically just where we graph the cumulative frequencies. Okay, now for the second part of this example, we're going to use all the information that we just put in our chart to draw our histogram and our frequency polygon. Okay, so I'm going to split this up into 2 parts. So I'm going to put the histogram over here, and I'm going to put the frequency polygon over on this side. Okay, when we draw a histogram, it's basically a bar chart where we're graphing the frequency on the y-axis. And remember, it's really important to make sure that our bars for the histogram touch each other. There should be no spaces between. So when we graph a histogram, we always want to use the class boundaries so that we don't have those gaps. So on the y-axis, we're going to label this frequency. On the x-axis, we label whatever this means. In this specific example, the data represents the number of books. Okay, now we're going to use our class boundaries. We're going to start at 0.5 and we're going to go to 2.5. that will represent our first bar. Then 2.5 to 4.5 will be our second bar, and then 4.5 to 6.5 will be the third bar, and then 6.5 to 8.5 will be the last bar, or the fourth group. Now, when you look at the frequencies for the classes are 19, 21, 8, and 2. So just make sure you scale it in a way that it makes sense and that you can have all of those values on your y-axis. I'm going to go out to say, usually you want to go out a little bit past your largest number. I'll go out to say 30. Now you can scale it different ways, but just make sure that all of the values that you're going to graph are on that scale and it's easy to read. Okay, so if I look at the frequency for the first group, the frequency is 19. So I want to make sure that I create my bar that goes up to a frequency of 19. So it's going to be a little bit below 20. And a lot of times you'll see, when you have a histogram, you'll see that the person who draws it puts a little 19 above that, so you can see exactly where it lands, because sometimes it's hard to see if it's in between two of the tick marks. Now the second bar that goes from 2.5 to 4.5, that should go out to 21, so that's going to go a little bit above 20. And I'm going to put a 21 above that. Then the third bar has a frequency of 8, so that's going to go a little bit below 10. And then the last bar goes up to 2, so below the first tick mark, that's a 2. So notice there are some important things about this histogram. I labeled my axes. That's very important. And I used my boundaries. Okay, so that way I don't have any spaces between the bars. You always want to use your boundaries. So those are some key things that you should make sure that you're paying attention to when you're drawing a histogram. Now for a frequency polygon, we're basically going to do the same thing, but rather than draw bars, we're going to draw lines. And we're going to use the midpoints because we're doing dots and not bars. Okay, so the midpoints are going to go on the x-axis. So our midpoints were 1.5, 3.5, 5.5, and 7.5. And of course, you always label your axes. So this is going to be the number of books. Same thing on the other side, or on the y-axis, we're going to do frequency. And I'll just scale it the same. I'm going to go by 5. Okay, when you make your frequency polygon, you want to start and end on the x-axis. So I'm going to have 2 dots on either side of my first midpoint and my last midpoint. I want it always to drop back down to the x-axis. Now, for the midpoint 1.5, that's in the first class, and that frequency was 19. So I'm going to come up at 1.5, draw a point for 19. Then at 3.5, that's for the second class, and that's going to be a frequency of 21. So I'm going to go up a little bit higher than 20 and label that 21. Then for the third class with the midpoint 5.5, we have a frequency of 8, so that's not quite 10. And then for the last midpoint, for the last class, we have 2. Once we make all the points, I'm going to start on the x-axis and I'm just going to connect the dots. So that's what your frequency polygon looks like. Okay, in the second example, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to create a frequency chart. This time we're going to use 5 classes. And then we're going to use that information to create our histogram and frequency polygon. So remember, the first thing you want to do is find your class width. And that will tell you how you can set up your class limits, which then helps us figure out how to set up our class boundaries. So everything is going to start with the class width. And remember, the class width is the maximum minus the minimum, and then you divide by the number of groups or classes. Okay, so in this example, If you look through all the values, the highest number is 24. When I subtract the minimum, that's a 0. That's your lowest number, and we're doing 5 classes, so we want to divide this up into 5 groups, so I'm going to divide by 5. Now, when I divide this, I'm going to get 4.8, and remember, you always, always, always round up to the next whole number. Even if your class width itself comes out to a whole number, you still have to bump it up to the next whole number to make sure that all the values fit into one of these categories. And if you underestimate, you might not have a value that fits in one of the categories. Okay, so then we know our class width is going to be 5, which means I want 5 numbers in our groups. So we're going to always start with the minimum number. And our minimum number here is 0. And then we want to include 5 numbers. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we want to go from 0 to 4. And remember, another way to look at it is I take the minimum value and you add 1 less than the class width. Because you're counting that first number, that 0, as one of your values. So 0 is the first value, and then you want 4 more values. You're going to take 0 plus 4, and you're going to get 4. So you have a total of 5 values in your group. So then when you go to the next group, the next class, you're going to start at the next number. Okay, and then I'm going to add 4 again. Now I'm adding 4 because we want a total of 5. We're including that first number plus 4 more for a total of 5. So 5 is the first number plus 4 more values after that. So I'm going to take 5 plus 4. So you always want to add 1 less than whatever your class width is. Then I'm going to go to 10 and then go to 14, then 15 to 19, and then 20 to 24. All right, now for our class boundaries, remember we want to go a half to the left of the minimum value and a half to the right of the highest value, and we close the gap that way. So for our class boundaries, we're going to have 0.5 to 4.5. Then we're going to have 4.5 to 9.5. Then 9.5 to 14.5. 14.5 to 19.5, and then 19.5 to 24.5, and that closes our gaps. So this is what we're going to use for the bars of the histogram. Now for the midpoints, we need that for our frequency polygon. So remember, to find the midpoint, you take the lower boundary and you add it to the upper boundary and you divide by 2. So I'm going to take negative 0.5 and I'm going to add it to 4.5, and then I'm going to divide by 2. That should give you a 2. For the midpoint for the second class, I'm going to take 4.5 plus 9.5 and take that answer and divide by 2, and you're going to get 7. And then when you keep doing that, you should get 12, 17, and 22 for the rest of your midpoints. Now, for the frequency, again, you can do this by hand, but it makes it a lot easier when you put the data in on your calculator and you sort it, because it helps you so that you don't miss any numbers. So if you want to use your calculator and practice, pause the video. You want to enter in all of these data values into your first list and then sort it, just like I showed you on the first example. So go ahead and pause the video and do that, and then we're going to come back and we're going to enter in the frequencies. Okay, now that you've sorted your data on your calculator, you should see that on the first interval or the first class, there's 2 values that fall between negative 0.5 and 4.5. For the second class, you should see that there's 3 values that fall between 4.5 and 9.5. For the third class, there should be 4 values that fall on that interval. And then if you continue, you'll see that you have 7 and then 9 for the last 2. For the relative frequency, we have a total of 25 values in this example. So we want to find the portion of values that lie on that interval. So for the first one, since we have 25 values in total, I'm going to say, well, I have 2 out of 25 values that lie on that interval. And if I put that in decimal form, that should be 0.08. For the next row or the next group, that would be 3 out of 25. That's going to be 0.12. Then this is going to be 4 out of 25. That should be 0.16. 7 out of 25. That should give you 0.28. And then 9 out of 25. That should give you 0.36. Now, because these are proportions, this should add up to 1 or 100%. Now, when you're rounding, it might be slightly off. Like you might get 0.998 or something like that. So just know, because of rounding, sometimes it doesn't add up exactly to 1, but it should come pretty darn close that you can see that you've got 100% of the data added there. Now, for the cumulative frequency, remember that's where we add it up for each row to see up to that point in total what's the frequency. So when we start with the cumulative frequency for the first row, we always start with 2. That's our first frequency. Then I want to see how much in total do I have in the first 2 rows. So I'm going to add the 2 and the 3. That gives me a 5. Now, when I go to the third class, the cumulative frequency, I have to add in the 4, so that gives me a 9. Then I keep adding down, so this is going to give me a 16 and a 25. And this should be the total number of data values that I have in my data set. If not, I made a mistake somewhere and I got to go back and check. Now, again, we're not going to work on this kind of graph in this lesson, but when you draw what's called an ogive, you would be drawing the cumulative frequency in a graph. Now, when we make the histogram, we're going to be using the frequency. And the same thing with the polygon, frequency polygon. We're going to be using the frequency column. Okay, so let's go ahead and draw our histogram and frequency polygon. I'm going to do my histogram here, and then my frequency polygon here. Okay, so for my histogram, I want to make sure that I'm using my boundaries to draw my bars, because remember, we don't want any spaces between the bars. So when I draw my boundaries, I'm going to come out to minus 0.5, and then to 4.5, and then 9.5, and then 14.5, and then 19.5, and then for my last bar, it's going to go up to 24.5. Now, this data represents, if you read the information in the problem, this represents the number of hours playing video games. So down here, I'm going to label this as number of hours playing video games. It's very important that you label your graphs. And then on the side here, I'm going to label this as my frequency, because that's what we're going to graph here. Now, for my frequency, the highest value it goes up to is 9, so maybe I'll go up to 10. So I'll go by ones here, I guess. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so there's my frequency. Now I just got to make my bars. So for my first bar, I have a frequency of 2. So that bar goes from minus 0.5 to 4.5. So that's going to come up here. My second bar has a frequency of 3. This is 2. This is 3. My next bar goes up to 4. then 7, and then 9. Now notice in this specific example that the bars go up from left to right in increasing order. When you see any kind of bar graph that does that, when everything is ordered from smallest to largest as far as the height of the bars goes, that's called a Pareto chart, because the bars are going in increasing order. Okay, now for our frequency polygon, we're going to label it the same way. This still represents the same data. So this is going to be the number of hours of video games per week. Let me make sure I label that here, per week, to be consistent. Okay, and then I'm going to go by ones up to 10 here. And this is also, we're graphing the frequency, so that's going to go on the y-axis. Now, when we graph our frequency polygon on the x-axis, we're going to put our midpoints. So we're going to put 2, 7, 12, 17, and 22. And remember, we're always going to start and end on the x-axis. So it's a good habit to get into to draw those points right away, so you remember to do that. Now, the midpoint 2, when I look at that class, that has a frequency of 2, so I'm going to draw my dot above 2 at 2. For 7, we have a frequency of 3. For 12, we have a frequency of 4. For 17, we have a frequency of 7. And then for the midpoint 22, on that interval, we have a frequency of 9. Okay, so now I'm going to connect the dots. And there is our frequency polygon for the number of hours played of video games per week. In this last example, we're going to go over what's called a time series graph. And that's just your basic graph where you have your x and your y-axis, and you're going to graph some ordered pairs and then connect the dots with lines. But it's specifically called a time series graph because you're tracking something over a period of time. So your x-axis for a time series graph is always going to represent some time interval. And so it will be, for example, in minutes, hours, days, years, etc. Okay, your y-axis is going to be whatever it is that you're measuring. In this example, you can see that we are measuring CPI. So we're tracking CPI over a period of certain years from 2003 to 2012. So we're just going to graph this like we would any other graph, like ordered pairs. The time unit is going to go on the x-axis. So we're going to label this, since this is in years, this is going to be years here. And then we're graphing the consumer price index. That's what's going to go on the y-axis. Now, the lowest value in this column for the consumer price index is at 184, so that's where we're going to start. And we want to go up to about 229 or 230, probably go to 230. I think I'm going to leave myself some more room here. Now, when you're not starting at 0, it's a good idea to draw this little compression symbol to let the person who's reading the graph know that the values between 0 and 184 is compressed down in that portion of the graph. And the same thing goes for the x-axis too. Since I'm going to start at 2003 and not 0, I need to let the reader know that I'm adjusting that scale so we can zoom in on a particular window. So that's what the squiggle line means. It's compression of the graph. Okay, so we're going to start at 2003 and we're going to go up to 2012. So we're going to go, let's go by 1 since we're only going up to 2012. So this will be 04, 05, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then this will be 2012. Now, for the consumer price index, we want to go, we're going to start at 184, and we want to go up to 229. So maybe we can go by 5s, 189. So I'm going to keep adding 5 until we get up to where we need to be. Remember, you want these tick marks to represent the same value, otherwise you could have scaling issues and it could be misleading when someone reads the graph. Okay, whoops, that should be 234. Okay, so here are the scales. So now we just have to graph our dots. So at 2003, we have 184, so that's going to be here. At 2004, it's just about 189, so I'm going to come up at 2004 and graph close to 189, and then I'm going to just go through that process of graphing these ordered pairs. Okay, when we go ahead and connect the dots, we get something that looks like this. Overall, it looks like it's increasing from 2003 to 2012. We do have a little dip there where it does decrease 1 year, but overall it increases. So just a quick review, when you're graphing anything, you want to make sure that everything is labeled. Both your axes, everything is scaled appropriately, and it's easy to read.